Okay. I think almost everything is set up here. To expand, to mute. Great. Now I can also see comments. Okay. Um, right. If you are watching this live, feel free to say hi. If you are watching this as a replay, just so you know, I don't see people's comments unless they tag me. So if you want me to be sure to see your comment, if you're watching this as a replay instead of live, then be sure to tag me. So today I want to talk about truth. is I want to ground this as much as possible. I don't want this to become purely abstract philosophical, um, but it's a fusion of the two. It's a fusion of a general perception and the lived experience of each moment. So uh, earlier today, I was having a conversation with some friends about how are we coping. How are each of us managing to cope? This is a small group, about 5 of us. We get together on Friday mornings to do a sort of interpersonal meditation practice, basically. And part of our checking in process involved, hey, like this time the question arose, what are you all doing what are each of us doing to navigate the chaos and stay grounded, or to not ground and we're instead like numbing ourselves out? Or like, how are each of us dealing with this? This wasn't just the excitement of this week and for this week's episode of United States. Although it certainly includes that. But like the whole uncertainty, this is in the context of like one of the people in that group was talking about maybe signing a 3-year lease for an office space for her shop. Another was talking about kind of freaking out about what's going on in the United States and wondering about how to move to a place where there's a small, sane community, and like whether that's even possible, and if so, how to do that. So there's this question of how are each of us navigating this? It really stands out for me because on some level, where I come from, like I noticed myself mostly just not being flustered by things like what happened this week. It was actually a little there's a part that was a little annoying in that I felt myself getting a little hooked, just a little bit, in terms of ooh, what happened at the Capitol? Ah, drama. And I don't mind the interest, and there's some sincere curiosity of, well, what is going on? But there was a part of me that was a little tempted to sort of get into it, like what's going on? What's the drama? Um, and for the most part, I successfully avoided digging into it. It was hard not to because everybody was talking about it. Even my parents, who for the most part don't dive really hard into politics by any means, mostly try to stay aloof to it. Um, I still got bits at the lunch table about, hey, did you hear what happened? Oh, there's this. Well, here's what I heard, and I'm like, okay. And it's good to have some clue of it. But there's a confusion that I see over and over again in myself, and part of the process is me weeding this out and noticing this is everywhere. As I clear it out and I look around, and my mind is more and more uncorruptible as I'm able to breathe more freely, and I see the deep importance of weeding out my own misperceptions. What I notice is we're living in a mass psychosis. That's just what's going on. We're all living in a mass psychosis. It's not unique to this year by any means. I wouldn't be too surprised if this psychosis has been going on for most of human history. But at the very least, it's been around for as far back as I can recall. So what I want to do is point at this psychosis. I want to point at, to the extent that I can, the ways that I notice it being alive in me. Although anytime you can point at your own psychosis and go, yeah, right here is where I'm crazy, and it's not just an abstraction, but it's something that is lived. Excuse me, that I can, like when I can tell, oh, in this area I am crazy in this way. To the extent that anything like that happens, there's freedom. There's no way to maintain stuckedness on that particular breed of crazy, if you can name it. Like there are some, like if you like the words crazy, insane, or have a kind of complication about them when we use them in the culture. But in terms of mental health disorders, um, like I actually, when I say psychosis, I don't just mean to drop a name like we're doing a bad thing. I mean psychosis. I mean trying to live in a reality that is different than the one one's physical body is in, while insisting that's not what's happening. That's psychosis. And our culture is built on psychosis. it's, I talked about this in August, but I feel like I have a much cleaner, tidier way of describing it now. It's much more lived, much more obvious. So, but by way of contrast, if we talk about something like dealing with anorexia or bulimia, some kind of eating disorder, you can know and even experience, I have this challenge. But knowing that and feeling the challengingness of it and knowing that it's not sane doesn't prevent the challenge from arising. Same thing as well. It's not the same thing. I'm giving this as a contrast. There's a way where when we feel psychosis, when we feel our own psychosis, it doesn't stop the mind from generating the illusions, but we can know they're illusory, which means that you go from being psychotic to being confused. That's a really helpful transition. It's a necessary one. A lot of what we're dealing with is we are feeling the confusion of reality smashing into our being. That's like a pretty good, that's my sense of the summary of what's been going on the last decade. It's just gotten really acute this last year. And this week is no exception. Frankly, this week had nothing special. I know like people stormed I'm a little confused, but I think it was specifically the legislative buildings. Great. That is not surprising. Like I wasn't going to predict specifically that, but this didn't feel, it didn't feel like it was outside of parameters. So, and I think I get the impression that a lot of people have this sense, sort of like, oh, this is like this is like last gasp of 2020 or something. Like, of course we would expect something like that in 2020. Oh, it's 2021, kind of. Like there's this weird period up until somewhere in around February where it's sort of the previous year, kind of. So anyway, instead of feel this excitement, there's a lot here that I want to share that to me looks like a coherent piece. It's a very simple piece once the mandala is drawn. It's very, very simple. I feel very tempted to make sure that I cover all of the details. My mind gets very excited and it stimulates a lot of energy and some anxiety. Like I really want to share all of this. The main piece particularly came alive for me in my conversation with my friends earlier today about how are we coping? The main piece for me is recognizing, like I told them, well, it's not so much that I cope. It's more like I recognize the way in which this is the manifestation level. This is the mechanical output of where intention is coming from. And what we're dealing with, what's manifesting, is the way in which our collective intention has not been to align with truth. I borrowed this use of the word truth from Perry Chase. I think there's an ambiguity that's really important to clean up. I even watch her on her own posts trying to clarify, I don't mean this kind of truth, I mean this kind of truth. But it's truth, it's the real truth. And like, yeah, I'm attributing an energy to her that's not really what she carries, but I'm highlighting that logically when trying to look at what does that even mean? What does it mean to choose truth? I think that if you talk to most people, Like if I talk to the people around where I live, and one of the people have one of these signs that says, "In this house, we believe Black Lives Matter. Life is life. No one is illegal." And I'll have a bunch of things that basically is like this sign that's saying, "I'm a leftist." I'm like, okay, cool. You're a leftist. Congratulations. Um, Asking them, well, what is true? Get some of those slogans, some of those ideas. Well, Black Lives Matter. That's true. And they might even admit, of course, all lives matter, but Black lives, like there's some question that seems to be in the culture about Black lives. So there's a need to say that. And that fact, everything I just said is true. Um, I think that the word truth in this case is creating some confusion that supports the psychosis. I know I haven't named the psychosis yet here, so just bear with me. I have to make a distinction. The distinction can get very slippery. There's a part of me that really, really wants to talk about the mother's arm fallacy. Let's see, is that going to be important here? I don't think so. I don't think so. I'll just say that it's important to be aware that what I am pointing at here is something that you can see for yourself. This is not a matter of believing me. This is a matter of me pointing at reality and saying, do you notice where you are? So, there are, I claim, two kinds of truth. There's the one that we normally talk about that is verbalizable. There's a reason for that. It corresponds to the left hemisphere. Right? There's a lot of, in the left hemisphere is where I'm pointing actually, I may be off by a little bit, but it's somewhere around here, the language centers for the brain, Broca's and Wernicke's area, but especially Broca's area. It's responsible for speech. So you end up with the version of truth that we can articulate, that we can put into words, that we talk about, is going to tend to be the left hemisphere's version of truth. That's going to be pretty systematic. Hey, Jadu, I don't know what you're saying. Yes, I do in reply to. I think there's a bit of a delay since I'm now doing these through Zoom. I think there's something like a 5 to 10 second delay between where I see the comments. So I'm not quite sure what your yes, I am doing too. Okay, so actually, I don't need to, I can move this over farther and make myself more visible. Just a second, I'm trying to make it so that I'm not distracted by my own picture that's out of time. There we go. Ha, okay. I know where I am. Excellent. Congratulations. I struggled to do that. So there's this question of, you look at something like, notice I'm about to jump into something that can be very abstract, and I want to ground this a great deal. So look at things like, okay, let's grab, was there voter fraud? This is a big question that's been floating around in various ways. I'm not up on the narrative because I don't care. There's just something important about why I don't care. I don't mean that it doesn't matter whether there's voter fraud, but also it doesn't matter. Maybe I'll explain that if it makes sense. If it makes sense for me to do so. So on the one hand, there's this question of, well, what is the truth? And that when we say truth in that sense, we're talking about the truth that can be named. This is a correspondence truth. This is, well, when I say voter fraud, I mean this particular structure. I'm talking about, like, there's this idealized version where people have voted for a specific person in this particular, or specific policies or whatever. In this case, we're talking about presidency. Did people vote for Trump or Biden or someone else? But someone else really doesn't matter because of the way the system is set up right now. So there's this question of, okay, well, each person in fact put a ballot in with an intention. And when you look across all of those intentions, you should end up with a count that there's an objective answer to how many people voted for Trump and how many voted for Biden. And if there was some sort of intentional effort to distort those numbers such that we ended up with Biden winning the apparent election, then that would be fraud. So then there's a question of, did that happen or didn't it? I mean, so when you ask something like, well, how do you rely on truth? How do you ground in truth in this situation? That sounds like a need for information and reasoning and a need to dig through a bunch of pieces. But that is getting sucked into this thing that I'm calling the psychosis. It's worth bearing in mind that right now you're listening to this video. Where is this count? In order to answer that question, there is a need to leave the present moment and enter a thought bubble, and then treat the thought bubble as true. Now that inherently is not psychotic. That's not a divorcing from reality. That's just what the left hemisphere is for. It's a computer. It simulates simplified realities so that we can come up with answers that we wouldn't be able to come up with from our immediate sensory experience. It makes sense to say that Washington, D.C. exists. It makes sense to say that Paris exists. It makes sense to say that I was born a few decades back. And even though I am not currently experiencing any of these things, it makes sense to say these. But there's a fracturing that is very typical of the left hemisphere. The fracturing of these models that will go an extra step. As it's almost like I want to say two things at the same time here. One piece is that the left hemisphere's models are fractured. They're incoherent. Back in August, I was talking about this in terms of the shattered psyche, that there's no coherence to people's experienced worlds. But and then this gets to the second part, but there is no awareness of the shattering, no awareness of the mind shatter, because the way the mind is shattered includes systematic skipping over exactly the cracks in the psyche so that they're not immediately experienced. So one way that you can experience this is first ask yourself, like, does Paris exist? Even if you're not in Paris, I think most people who are listening to this would go, yeah, of course. The second question is, well, where is it? Paris is in France. Maybe you think Paris is in Europe. Paris is to the east. Paris is over the ocean. But it's worth checking, what are you experiencing when you're answering that question? Can you point at Paris? Right? So here's a fun puzzle. I had to spend some time thinking through the geometry of this. This to me is a very proper integrated use of the left hemisphere. I had to work out the geometry of the Earth in order to answer the question, where is Paris? Because there's an issue where that direction for me is east. And Paris is almost straight east of me. It's almost at the same latitude. I'm a little bit south of Seattle, and Seattle is basically at the same, I think the term is longitude. It's the same distance north-south as Paris. So basically straight east is Paris. But in point of fact, that is how I would point straight at Paris. About 40 degrees down, I think it's 40 degrees. I'd have to go back and check the measurements. I think it's about 40 degrees down. I just remember the angle that it feels with my arm. It's down in that direction to the northeast. Now, why is that? I can go into the geometry of it. I can explain these in depth. The short version is that wherever you're standing on the globe, the angle that you're standing at is going to curve, but the planes that define east and west don't angle with you. So typically you're going to experience those planes as angled through the Earth at the same latitude you're at. And mine is around 40-ish degrees, right? So the actual arc of going east-west cuts at this angle rather rather than being a straight up and down line. If you didn't understand that, that's perfectly fine. But the point is that when it comes to the embodied sense of where Paris is, it's actually in that direction. But most people don't notice that there's certainty that Paris exists, but their inability to relate it to the physical scenario where their bodies are means that the reality of Paris is basically a mental hallucination that they are convinced is real. That is psychosis. Now, it turns out that most most of these kinds of mind fractures, most of these pieces don't matter. They are falsehoods that don't matter. And for most people, it doesn't matter that they can't point at Paris. For me, it was important for emotional reasons because right now my girlfriend is near Paris. So if I want to know where she is spatially relative to me, and as I integrate my sense of how all of reality is one thing, one coherent beast, um, then I need to have some lived sense of where she is. It's not strictly necessary, but I prefer it. So I'm going to try to manage to hide the chat. There we go. But for most people, it doesn't matter. It's not going to matter. It's not going to affect anything about their lives at all to not know how to point at Paris. But what does matter is the inability to notice by default that these things aren't connected to the reality of the lived experience. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because the lived experience of the body and the body's movements and the intentions of this present moment, it's not just one more thing. It's not, oh yeah, I have a body and also Paris exists and also E equals MC squared. It's not one of many things. That's more of the mind shatter. This is the point of action. This is what I have the ability to notice and to act on. To the extent that I have anything that is like free will, that free will exists right here. What's going on in Paris as an abstraction can't matter until it's grounded in terms of how I relate to it, in terms of my physical, actionable choices. Now, it turns out having grounded that, it still doesn't matter that much. Although it does do a neat thing of I can pick up the laptop and move it so that I'm pointing down towards where my partner is when we're Zooming. I mostly haven't done this, but I can. And it's this neat thing like we're looking through a portal at each other. If she does the same thing and figures out how to point it at me, it sort of creates a neat experience of the lived spatial reality. And that matters. And that creates a sense of she isn't just far away, but she's there. She's right there. Right? So that creates a lived experience for me. So this disconnect from reality shows up much more potently when you look at things like, why are people freaking out about what happened in DC this week? I bet, unless you're in DC, if you look around your physical environment, nothing has changed. Except, of course, for the actions of people who are freaking out about what happened in DC. Right? There's no problem. Right? That doesn't mean there can't be one, but it's worth checking, can you do anything about it? If so, well, great, that's a clear action that you can do. But there's this, but the question is not, can you think of something people can do about it? Is there something you can do with your body and your voice that you can observe has a real effect? If not, then what's the problem? It's like worrying about solar flares. They're worth knowing about in case they come and impact you. It's worth having some awareness of and accounting for things like Do you have the supplies that you need in your garage so that if the electrical grid goes down, you can still eat, right? Right. So there's a there's a pragmatism about this that's about being grounded in reality. It's very, very different from the lived version of truth. Sorry, it's very different from the mental version of truth that we normally live in as a culture, where we treat things um, like, well, is systemic racism a thing? If so, what should we do about it? Where these feel like real questions. And I think there's a version of it that very much is a real question. It's very important. And I think it could be phrased identically, but the energy behind it is very different. Like it seems like there's some sort of systemic problem that Blacks run into. What would be a kind way of organizing society, and how do we reach it? Mm. And how do each of us play into the creation of that possibility? Like to me, that energy, that way of orienting to it has potential. But there's racism and it's bad. Rah! Like that, like what's with the body freaking out? Why is the body freaking out? What is that doing? This is not to invalidate the emotions or even the concerns. It's noticing the extra thing that's happening there isn't connected to a perception of cause and effect that can do anything. It's basically trying to drag people into the same psychotic state in order to share in a psychotic dream so that there is this impression of control. There's this impression of, well, if I can get you to freak out about the same thing I'm freaking out about, and we can both share in this concocted freak out delusion, then within that, I can point out what you need to do, and maybe you'll do it. So we don't typically reason this explicitly, but this happens all the time. You look at things like in romantic relationships, people having this orientation of, well, if you really loved me, then you wouldn't go on this trip. Right? That's an interesting fantasy. Um, it's sort of like there's this question of, is there real love? Love is proven by actions. Um, and if the other person buys into it, then it sort of becomes true because the experience of love between those two people is defined by the actions. So there's kind of this validation within the psychotic hallucination. Um, so if the other person buys into it, going, really? Okay, well then I guess I won't go on the trip. It's like, the problem isn't the trip. The problem isn't the lack of love or demonstration. The problem is that there's a psychotic episode happening. This is not a I say this. I want to be very clear when I'm talking about this. I do know what truly drastic, life destroying psychosis is actually like. I've seen this. I suspect I've experienced things like this, although mine have always been chemically induced. I've experienced a lot of plant medicines, like down in Peru, trying ayahuasca, huachuma, which is a form of mescaline. Um, in Mexico, I worked with uh, a bufo, which is a form of 5-MeO-DMT. These these experiences, I think, are chemically induced psychosis. Well, although arguably it's the opposite of psychosis, they do something very interesting. Um, there's the detailed model, but whatever. The but I've observed enough, and I know this stuff to understand. Like I've had a number of people that um, have been close acquaintances, and sometimes I would even call them friends, who have gone psychotic. One of whom, in an actual psychotic break, ended up attacking a woman that he didn't know, and as a result went to jail for several years. Right. So, like this is so I'm not, I don't mean to trivialize psychosis at all when I'm saying this. I am saying that the problem we find ourselves in is psychosis. Like that our world situation is an example of the human race going through a psychotic episode. Right? This is what it looks like. This is what it's like on the inside to be a cell of an organism that is having a psychotic break. Okay? So I'm absolutely not trivializing psychosis. I'm pointing out we're in one collectively. This is it. So it's important to understand what it means to navigate this sort of challenge in order to do something more sane, to offer something more beautiful to the world and to yourself. And I'm sharing from things that I feel like I've had to work out a lot on my own, and I'm still weeding this stuff out. I'm noticing all of these places where I live in these weird bubbles that I just don't notice. The bubbles are useful, but when I start pretending that that's what's real, this is when I create a real problem. So, in terms of truth, what's meant by truth? The left brain version, I keep wanting to use my right hand for the left brain, as the left brain corresponds to the right half of the body, the right brain to the left half of the body, although the right brain is better at both. Complicated, but anyway, on the one hand, there's this left hemispheric way of talking about truth. And that's does your map match the territory? We talk about voter fraud. Like, here is a model of how voter fraud could have happened. Does that match the world or doesn't it? Yes or no. There are going to be facts, and you can get the facts and line them up and see, does the correspondence work? What would we expect to see in the world? What would we expect not to see in the world? And go and investigate, and then we can find out whether this model is correct. Sounds sensible. Seems like the basis of science. It's also gibberish in a really important way, because you can't actually ever check that your map matches the territory. It doesn't make any sense. Like, if you look at a road map of a city, the value of the road map is it. For one thing, there's the old quip of, sure, the map is not the territory, but you can't fold the territory up and put it in your glove compartment. And so there's use in there being a difference between the map and the territory. But the map, in order for the map to be useful, there has to be some sort of connection between the map and the territory. And the claim is that the implicit claim when we're talking about truth is that that correspondence is accuracy. But that doesn't make any sense. You have to live in a psychotic hallucination in order for that to make sense, as though it is correctly describing reality. It doesn't mean that you can't determine whether maps are more or less useful, and that you do it by doing this kind of correspondence. But to talk about that as to whether the map is correct, it requires disconnecting from reality in a very particular way. So what a mind has to do when looking at a roadmap, first off, it's worth recognizing that roadmaps are horrendously distorted. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the map of a city, like the map of a city, and yeah, like you can see how each of the roads are angled correctly and they're labeled correctly. Well, correct based on what? Each point of the map, like the overall visual effect of the map is as though you're way above the city and you take a photograph of it. And then a bunch of stuff is cleaned up to make certain parts highlighted. But like, that's the basic idea. You're trying to get some sort of aerial view of the whole city. But an aerial view from where? Because each point of the map has its geometry set up so that, like the way that the roads are drawn, such that it's as though you're taking a picture from right above that point. But that's true for every single point of the whole map. So the perspective is not actually like you're just flying above the city and you take a photograph. It's like you fly above the city and you take a photograph of what is exactly below you, and then you move over and you do it again and again and again, and then you paste all of those together. So what is the perspective of the map. It's like you're taking a picture from a plane instead of from a point. Right? So it's actually massively distorted in a very important way. In fact, your eyes won't pick up on the details of the map properly unless you move your eyes to be right over the center of where the map is. Hey, Gordon pushes, Michael, I think you're saying that abstraction equals psychosis, which doesn't seem useful. No, I'm saying that that pretending that abstraction is reality is psychosis. That living in the abstraction, out of context of what it has been abstracted from, and then insisting that that is what is true. And then one further step, because of how the left hemisphere works, blinding yourself to the fact that you have made that move, that is psychosis. Okay. No, I think abstraction is intensely useful. And it's actually it's an essential feature of our ability to feel into the depths of reality in ways that we can't without that kind of abstraction capacity. I think it's absolutely critical. What I'm looking at are things like when people get really riled up about what Trump should or shouldn't do, what the government should or shouldn't do. Like, what does that even mean? And what is the energy being marshaled for? And is it to, like, it's not even clear, right? It's an important, got an important distinction. Yeah. Yeah, this it is slippery, but yeah, this is, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, so on the roadmaps, there's this critical issue where when we say, but is the map accurate? What we're really asking is something about, when I use the map to navigate my lived experience, do I end up with anticipations that get violated from using the map? That's a lot closer to what we actually mean. If we end up with violations, then the map as a tool ends up not being as useful. And the description we give for that, when we take the world and we then abstract it into a model as though there is a true reality that can correspond to the map. When we're trying to get these two to sync up, we can then say, well, do they match? But the map never matches your lived embodied experience. Right? There's no way to fly above a city and view it from a 2D plane. That doesn't make any sense at all. Right? The only time the map matches your experience is when you are staring at the map. So now this doesn't, that distinction, and Gordon mentions precision versus accuracy distinction is also useful here. Yeah, I'm not quite sure exactly how, but I believe you. I can feel that in this space, but I haven't pinned down exactly where that matters. But I want to say, in talking about all of this with roadmaps, this doesn't affect at all the practical use of roadmaps, but it totally affects things like what should the policies be about rolling out these vaccinations? Right, we're running into a problem where we may end up with mass spoilage of a whole bunch of vaccines instead of issuing them even to random people. Issuing them to random people would arguably, in terms of stopping a pandemic, be better than letting them spoil. Even though you may end up not giving them to the people who are highest priority. There's this whole political thing I bumped into. I read an article on lesswrong.com. There's a weekly, basically a news article that one person there does, which is a deep investigative use of rationality techniques and analysis, statistics, careful reasoning, debiasing techniques, in order to see what is the real picture of the world. And he's been like almost tearing his hair out of, I failed to be cynical enough to predict how many bizarre errors people could come up with being able to roll out these vaccines. Was not the only thing he's screaming about. It's actually quite entertaining if you like getting riled up. Um, but there's this thing of, well, why get riled up? What is the riling up about? Why get hooked this way? What's that for? Likewise, what is it for to think about what the policies should be? I think there is a place for that. But if it doesn't ground at the level of what am I doing right now? Not what am I doing about it? How am I getting actively involved? That's like one of the hallmarks. It's worth bearing in mind that one of the very common hallmarks of psychosis is a sort of elevated activation that causes somebody to have a sort of riled up, um, desperate excitement. This is not universal, but it's a pretty common symptom. Um, um, Jadu interjects, we are wired to care about the future, even if intangible and fragmented. Yeah, I'm not sure that's true. I'm actually not sure that's true. Um, I'm under the impression that uh, that what we're wired for, I mean, um, oh, as construed. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. We would need to define what it is that we're talking about here, and in particular, what we mean by what it means for humans to be wired for something. The animal bodies we use, it's kind of a funny way of talking about it. Who is using it? We are the animals, but these animal bodies we're using that we're running with, like they're really good at not dying right now, i.e., fight or flight. Yeah, yeah. So talking about what activates fight or flight, the body's fight or flight mechanisms activate when very low mechanisms in the body's system detect an immediate threat. So why would there be a fight or flight response to a future event that isn't here? Like if we found out, oh, there's a meteor coming for Earth and it'll be here in a decade and wipe out all life, this would probably cause a fight or flight response for a lot of people. But it's kind of quirky because if it's going to be a decade out, the fight or flight response is actually the wrong response in terms of actually dealing with the emergency, because we can't take action on a time scale of minutes or even hours that is going to actually deal with the issue in a way that is worth the physical and psychological and emotional exhaustion that will actually make us slower over the course of a decade. And in particular, have a harder time coordinating because the fight or flight response has a tendency to shut down some of our more sensitive social senses and our ability to feel into how to care for the community, which is the actual resource that we need in order to deal with the threat that's a decade off. So it doesn't actually make sense. So the question is, where did the activation come from? It wasn't from the meteor flying at my face and my body freaking out. It had to come from something like booting up a simulation of what that threat is, and then making that threat immediate as a method of activating the body. Now, where would that inclination to simulate it that way come from? I don't know, but I notice that it's it's not automatic. Like it's if what I mean by that is if you try to have conversations about the long term with children, this becomes particularly obvious with toddlers. You can actually really watch what the base software is like. You know, I noticed there's something about this that's getting off into the weeds. I don't know that this is going to be all that important, and I don't know whether or not we're even disagreeing in a meaningful way. What I'm the thing that I'm trying to highlight is that there's this addiction to a certain vision of truth that is this implicit correspondence theory. But it's not thought of that way most of the time. It's just this: are my ideas correct? What does correct mean? It means matches reality. But how does that matching work? And it means that it matches. There's this pragmatic skipping over exactly the gap that results that is the cracks in the shattered psyche. Like that addiction to that particular vision of what true means results in a maintenance of a collective psychosis. That collective psychosis is what causes this this insistence on collective should based thinking, what we should do about the vaccinations, what we should do about climate change, and why there's this inclination so strongly to lean into using blame and shame and guilt and emergency mode to try to rile people into agreeing and condemn people for disagreeing in ways that really don't make sense for solving the problem. Like to highlight what I think is a pretty blatant, concrete example. If you look back at the aftermath of the 2016 election when Trump first became president, the most obvious screaming need in the United States at that point was, what just happened? And, and, and there was some inclination to ask this question, but it was more like, what dumb fucks voted for Trump? At least where I was, that was kind of the tone. I was living in Berkeley at the time. So there's this, um, uh, there's this, there's an issue here where there was an obviousness in, like, for instance, in the environment I was in. I'm going to emphasize that here I was in an extremely leftist environment, and then orienting to um, Trump had just become president. How are we to make sense of this? What reality had just smashed into our faces was, somehow a lot of people really disagreed with things that we thought were obvious. But the reaction to this, rather than going, wait, what does this say about what is real? What is it that these people are attuning to? Where are we lacking a bridge, and how do we build a cultural bridge so that we can build an America together? This division is too big. We need to find a way to communicate and to set aside the inclinations to condemn. This is necessary, because otherwise we're just going to continue this divide. Jadu mentions hello from Berkeley. Um, and there's a couple of comments here. Yeah, I'll not jump into those just yet. So, but that wasn't the reaction. The reaction was to condemn all those stupid Trump supporters. And that continued for 4 years. Like, more and more vehement hatred of the stupidity of people who could dare to have a view that would support what Trump is doing, what Trump was saying, and who he was, how he was operating, which is doubling down on exactly the issue. So if you take a step back and you look at the system, there is no way for that condemnation to have had any effect other than making the situation worse. Like, how often has condemning a large group of people caused them to go, oh, you know what, you're right, we're being bad, and we should apologize, and you've now convinced us. Like, shy of torture, I don't know of any case of this actually working. So this wasn't thought through at all, as far as I can tell. Most of the leftist arguments that I saw, that I was surrounded with, had to do with people getting together and emphasizing how much sense their own perspective made, and how little sense Trump supporters made. Why? What is that doing? What is it in service of? I mentioned this yesterday in terms of it doesn't matter. Like one thing that's been clicking for me very deeply is that it doesn't matter what you do. All that matters is why you do it, where it's coming from, what's the energy behind it. The reason is that you can't actually change the causes by manipulating the effects enough to be able to make the causes shift to being that of creating the world that we want. So just looking across this whole thing, what world would everybody, I don't know about everybody, but what world would these people have to be operating in order to choose this action pathway? And like this is not just an idle thing of, oh, they didn't notice. I mean, this is at the level of I've seen people block each other, people who have been close colleagues and friends for years, block each other on Facebook and say, I just can't talk to you anymore because of the suggestion that they listen to Trump supporters more carefully, that they listen generously, that they find a way to bridge compassionately in order to understand what it is that's being cared for and how to meet them. The adamant response, not across the board, but in enough cases that it clearly mattered, was, I've already tried listening to them. They're completely nuts. They're unwilling to listen to reason. Unwilling to listen to reason. Disconnected from reality. So the strategy is to condemn them and try to marshal forces in some sort of implicit um, verbal war in order to win at politics in a way that has them feeling crushed the way that you felt crushed by Trump's victory. And they're doing the same thing? Like, what exactly is the plan here? Who's disconnected from reality? Like, maybe they are, but how? Like, there's, I feel like there's like there's a couple of things that I find would be essential education for a sane society. One of them would be um, along the lines of trip sitting for people who are going through really massive doses of psychedelics, um, or or something very comparable, which would be trying to interact with somebody who's having a psychotic episode, an actual clinical psychotic breakdown. You interact with a couple of people like that, and you start to piece together some sense of, oh, you can't just tell them, I'm sorry, you're wrong, here are the facts. It doesn't work that way. And they literally cannot hear it. This has been one of the ongoing puzzlements here, and part of the reason, like there's a couple of reasons for it. One is a phenomenon of the left hemisphere that I've come to term the "that's my mother's arm" fallacy. Um, is where the left hemisphere's entire job is to compute some sort of um, consistent bubble, some consistent model, and when it encounters information or evidence that doesn't fit its model, um, it will either force fit it, it will try to explain how it fits the model anyway, or it will reject the evidence as irrelevant or non-existent. You can end up with actual hallucinations where people will not be able to experience their own arm because it is inconsistent with their left hemisphere's model. There's some special instances of this that are just fascinating to look into. Some clinical cases of, for instance, strokes in the right hemisphere creating this kind of illusion because the right hemisphere is now shut down, and so all they have is the left. But there's another reason why this is difficult, which is that if you are living in one hallucination and you're trying to drag somebody else into somebody into yours, and they're in a different hallucination, and they're trying to do the same thing to you, it's now just a power play. Mm. So, in all of this, what I've been highlighting is the left hemisphere's version of truth. There's a different angle on what true means, or sort of what true should mean, depending on what you might want to use for the word true, should in this case, um, which is more like the right hemisphere's version. Is it real? Does it matter? A big, big clue here is that the right hemisphere has no ability to output language. It can input language just fine, but that this is the place from which, when I'm in an argument with someone, or even just when I'm in a conversation, I've been finding this in more and more subtlety as I pay attention to this more and more deeply. When I'm in a conversation, like with my partner, and I notice that where we're going feels kind of a little pointless or off in the weeds, or like I'm building up some kind of tension. This happened earlier when going into this business of here's how like fight or flight interacts with the mind and yada yada. And I just started to notice, this doesn't matter. I'm going off into the weeds. Um, like I'm losing track of what's grounded. So when picking up on that, there's this kind of subtle knowing that's in the back. Do I really want to get into this argument? Do I really want to say this quip? Um, it used to be that for me, I would only notice that I had heard this little whisper in the back of my mind quite a bit later, if at all, when reflecting on, yeah, I was kind of being a jerk in that conversation. And then going back and being willing to acknowledge it. Um, so that quiet, calling it a voice is funny because it's never linguistic. It's just a knowing. It's the same knowing that tells me that I can feel my tongue in my mouth. It's not an abstraction, it's an immediate experiential here-ness. It's embedded in the wholeness of my being. So when I'm looking at, so in terms of this original question that got posed at the beginning of my day, that I mentioned at the start of this live stream, well, how are you coping with all of these stresses and like all this chaos of the world where we can't even, we're planning a few weeks out is hard, but you still need to decide what you're doing for months into the future, but you don't even know what kind of world we're going to be living in 2 months down the road, or even 2 weeks. Like everything seems to be changing faster and faster, and everything's getting more chaotic. Um, so the short answer is I choose to trust reality. I don't mean this in a naive sense of reality is going to be good to me. So I'm just going to have faith in it and it will take care of me. Um, although I'm curiously finding something that is a lot closer to that than I would have thought a year ago. But what I mean is more like, where am I putting my trust? What am I relying on? Am I relying on a belief system or on models? Am I relying on my intellect? And what I find makes the most sense is to rely on the interplay between reality and my contact with it to keep me in sync with what is true, what matters, what's real. Um, a different way of saying that is the only path forward that makes sense to me is reversing and dissolving psychosis in myself as much as possible. That doesn't keep me safe, but it's definitely not doing that is not better. Because of that, when I see all of this chaos that's going on, a couple of things appear. First off is that as I've been doing this, as I've been developing more and more willingness to let myself be dramatically wrong about what is even real, to learn the lessons of death before death comes knocking. To the extent that I lean into this and I actually take in these lessons, and I actually stay in touch with what is true to the very best of my ability and expand my ability to the best of my ability. First off, I find that I can identify psychosis in the world around me much more easily, so much more easily, because I'm right here. I can see when people aren't here, when they're off in some sort of castle in the sky trying to live there, as though they're trying to get away from their physical bodies. They're creating these hallucinations and these abstractions. I know what it's like to be there, and I know what it's like to not be there, but to be here. So because of that, I see all these people freaking out about, oh God, what's happening in the Capitol? And here's this, and our nation. Like I've noticed a couple of people starting to freak out again about, is it time to move out of the United States? Well, what changed? What changed in the last week such that that feels like a relevant question? I bet there was nothing in this last week that was actually all that different from what was there before. The difference is something knocked into you. If you're one of the people who's operating in this frame, if you're not, don't worry about it. But if you are, if there's this fear, then then that means that reality broke through your ignorance of reality, like the willful ignoring, the ignorance. And now you're confronted with something which now there is this, okay, well, maybe I should try to find a way to leave. Maybe, maybe. Have you solved the basic problem yet? Have you noticed why there was ignorance in the first place in you? Like that question, like even if you don't haven't been stressed over the things that go on for over this last week, that question is pretty universal. I still have all these places where I dig up and I notice, oh, here is a mechanism I use to pretend that my body doesn't exist. And here's where I worry about fantasies that don't make any sense. Here's where I cling to ways that I need the world to be for me to be okay, which doesn't make any sense because what's the clinging for? What is the clinging for that is separate from desiring and intending? It's desire, intention, and have to-ness. What's the have to-ness for? To keep you from noticing a reality that feels painful in some way. But if reality is painful, then here I am experiencing it. And I'm going to be navigating it a lot better if I am in touch with truth. So I titled this video, Truth Will Win. And the reason I describe it that way is because that's a fact. I'm using the words truth and reality almost synonymously in this case. Truth in this sense is not an idea, it is what is. So saying reality will win, a different way to say that is you're guaranteed for all aspects of your psychosis to end. All of us are guaranteed that. What we're encountering now is that this is like unlike the thing of the psychotic belief that Paris exists in France, where France is some abstraction. Right? That psychosis doesn't matter for the most part, for most people. But the psychosis, the parts of the mind shatter, the parts of the collective psychosis that have us believing in the need to make one another do the right thing, that's starting to really matter. It's mattered a lot for decades, but we've been ignoring the signs. And this is very much like if you are completely dissociated from your body and you feel these weird, uncomfortable sensations in your stomach, and you deal with it by fantasizing about being a king and ruling over the world. And that the more pain there is, the more fervently you try to imagine things. Um, there are only a couple of possible outcomes for this. One is your mind shuts down because you get too hungry and you desperately need food. Another is that your hunger overrides how you are fantasizing so that you start fantasizing about feasts as a king. And then your body drags your hallucinating self down to the kitchen and you eat something. Or you die of starvation. I think there's probably a couple of other options, but the point is that at, I mean, there's another option. And these are the there's another option which is the cleanest, which is to recognize that imagining being a king doesn't solve the real problem, and to solve the real problem, you've got to be in touch with the discomfort you are in fact experiencing. You have to be willing to say yes to the reality that you most fear, but not the idea of the reality you most fear. You have to be willing to ignore the ideas and be here. If you do that, then all of these screwy outcomes you can bypass because you've already learned the lesson. That's what we're dealing with as a species. We are encountering, we're getting close to the limit here. Are we going to choose truth? Go willingly or be dragged. That's what we're looking at. We are guaranteed, individually and collectively, we are guaranteed an end to our psychosis. The question is, will we reach the last teacher of death? Because if nothing else, psychosis will destroy the host, and then the psychosis will end. Then you can't not be in truth, but you can't be you either. So that's what I keep seeing. That's what I keep looking at. I notice that this fact, this deep truth, go willingly or be dragged. This is ground level. I choose to go willingly. I go willingly as far as I possibly can. I notice that there are places where I don't know how to let go, and those take a top priority. That matters far, far more than any individual policy, any individual idea, and any social justice cause. We cannot actually create a better world until we're willing to live in it, until we're willing to prioritize the truth of being here. So I feel like that's pretty much my the main piece I wanted to tie in there. Much I feel like if I were writing this as an essay, it would be super easy to wrap up the whole thing as saying there are two kinds of truth. There's correspondence truth and there's is truth. and and for the most part, when we're living in this delusion of correspondence truth, we don't even notice how shattered our experience is. Our experience has holisticness here and now. Correspondences are useful tools for expanding our capacity to sense what is true here and now. But if we do not prioritize it in that direction, then we end up lost and confused until death comes knocking. That's the issue. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at individual cells, individual humans, groups of humans, the whole of civilization, all of the intelligence of the whole universe, to the extent that that's different from the whole human race. It doesn't matter what scale you're looking at. This law is fundamental. It's as fundamental as evolution. It is the nature of The law of evolution is that the dance of sex and death, loosely speaking, metaphorically speaking, but the dance of sex and death creates fitting to reality. And what I am describing is the force of death. You either go willingly or be dragged. Cool. All right. I think that's plenty for today. Thanks for popping in. Also, want to mention there are two comments that I didn't refer to directly here. Gordon mentions that quote collective psychosis end quote is the same thing as the parasite in terms of the in terms of the Four Agreements author. I actually don't know about the Four Agreements or the Four Agreements author. I've heard of this occasionally, but that sounds plausible to me. Jadu says in-group, out-group dynamics equal emotionally driven due to that quote-unquote addiction to quote, what I know is true, end quote. Yeah. Yeah. And Jadu adds, bravo, I am aware, I am here, mindful, thinking about thinking. Truth comes after I am willing to feel beyond ideas. Yeah. Thank you. I also want to remind any who are watching this as a replay, again, if you want me to see your comments, you need to tag me. Otherwise, I cannot get Facebook, as far as I can tell. And if you have a solution to this, I'd be happy to hear. I can't get Facebook to notify me when people give comments after the live stream is done, unless they tag me. I get notifications of tags. Cool. So thank you for listening. Until tomorrow.